Hi, I'm Father Jim Forson, and I'd like to share with you some reflections on the gospel of this 24th Sunday in Ordinary Time. You know, in our country right now, there's a lot of debate about our national debt and how in the world we're ever going to repay it. I don't know exactly what it is. I believe it's like $32 trillion, and Congress is arguing about should we raise taxes or lower spending and on and on and on. I have figured out how to solve the entire national debt. You laugh, stay with me. The solution is in the gospel today. It's the story about a king who calls in all the people who owe him money to pay him back. And one of them owes him 10,000 talents. Now, how much is that? Well, in those days, 1 day's labor was worth 1 denarii. 10,000 denarii was 1 talent. This guy owed 10,000 talents, which is comparable to 100 million days of labor, or in our economy, roughly more than $3 billion. So when he says, give me time and I'll pay you back what I owe, he's never going to be able to pay back $3 billion. Nobody can. It's impossible. But what happens? The king, in a moment of mercy and being magnanimous, he forgives the debt. There's our answer. The president calls in all the nations that we owe money to, and he reads them the gospel, and I imagine they're either disciples of Jesus or think fondly of him. He reads them the gospel and shows them the good king, and then he falls at their knees and says, forgive us our debt, and being disciples of Jesus or fond of him, they forgive us the national debt. Case solved. See? Now, I know I'm being ridiculous, but so is Jesus in the gospel today. The story he tells is a ridiculous story, because in those days, when that man could not possibly pay back that debt, what would ordinarily happen is, well, the king sends him off to prison or sells him into slavery. He takes his family and sells them all as slaves to get back whatever money he can. He takes all of his property and he sells all of that to get the money from it. That's what ordinarily happens. Nobody forgives a debt like that. And so in this story, this king is doing something that is just ridiculous. It's unheard of. But Jesus tells this story to explain to his disciples, if you follow me, that's the kind of forgiveness you have to extend. And this story begins with Peter asking Jesus, how often must I forgive my brother? 7 times, 7 times? And 7 being the number for infinity. Peter's question really is, do I have to forgive my brother in infinite times and infinite times? To which Jesus doubles down and says, no, not 7 times, 7 times, 70 times, 7 times, beyond infinity times infinity. Or in other words, radical forgiveness. Something just unheard of, that just isn't done. That's what you must do. You must practice that kind of forgiveness. He said that to them, and he says that to us. And that can be so hard a message to hear. And the response can easily be, are you kidding? That's ridiculous. I think of some families I know where they've gone through just an awful, ugly divorce, where the people just tore at each other and it spilled into court, and then there's arguments over child custody, and it's just a mess, and then the rest of the family gets involved, and it's just terrible. Terrible. And the woundedness that came from that divorce is so deep, and what people have done to each other is so grievous. Or I think of people who, have been the victims of abuse of whatever kind, violence, words, anger, whatever it might be. But the abuse was so profound, so deep. To hear Jesus say, radical forgiveness? Are you kidding? I can't do that. Nobody can. You have no right to ask that of me. But that's the path we have to walk. Because if we don't, then we run the danger of becoming like that servant in the gospel, who after he was forgiven much, he went off and found someone who owed him a mere fraction of what he had owed, and asked in almost identical words, "Give me time and I will pay you back in full." And he would hear nothing of it. He grabbed him by the throat, throttled him, and demanded, "You pay me back what you owe." He could not extend the mercy, the forgiveness that he himself had received. He was an ingrate. He was a monster. And if we can't practice radical forgiveness, if we can't, we who have been forgiven much in our life, over and over and over, by this generous King, God of ours, who does just the unthinkable, the impossible in forgiving us repeatedly throughout our lives, if we can't extend that kind of mercy to those who have deeply wounded us, then we run the risk of becoming monsters and going through this world and throttling it. I think Jesus calls all of us today to look into our hearts to see if we have been deeply, grievously wounded. Now, maybe there's some of us that haven't been, and there's a blessed few of us that have been able to go through life without that kind of wound. But I imagine all of us, if we look into our hearts, can be able to see, maybe right on the surface, maybe we're still carrying that wound and it's right there in front of us. Maybe some of us, it happened years and years ago. And the temptation might be just to, push it to the side, just to forget about it. I don't want to think about it. I don't want to talk about it anymore. But forgiveness never happened. Jesus today calls upon all of us to look into our lives, to see if in the present or somewhere in the past there was a wound, deep and unforgiven. I was thinking of myself that several years ago, my mom had a dinner party for a lot of her friends, and she invited me to come to it. And so I went over there. And my mom had this little dog. I don't know what it was, a Lapsel or whatever, a little rat dog. But my mom just loved that dog. And, I was over there at that party, and one of the people was teasing the dog and, pulling it by the ear or pulling it by the tail, and the dog was yipping, and I, all of a sudden, out of nowhere, this surge of anger rose up in me, and I almost said, "Get your hands off that dog, leave it alone." And I caught myself just in time. And when I was driving home that night, I thought to myself, "Forson, what is wrong with you? Where did that come from?" And then I remembered that when I was a little boy, I don't know, 8 or 10 years old, we had puppies, and I loved my puppy. And my mom and dad had these friends that would come over, and the guy, he would tease my puppy. He'd pull the tail and its ear and leg, and it would yip, and I would just hate that. And I'd ask my dad, why is he doing that to my dog? And Dad said, he's a little... And whenever they would come over, I would try to hide my dog. And he would go looking for it. It would make me so angry. And I had forgotten all about that. And who would have imagined that little 10-year-old boy, who at that point in time in his life was being deeply wounded, was still lying quietly in the heart of a 50-plus-year-old man, just waiting to be reawakened. Yeah. Jesus comes to all of us, even to 69-year-old men who have a 10-year-old child still living within them, deeply wounded. It says, radical forgiveness. He says to all the victims of divorce, of abuse, of whatever kind of grievous wound, radical forgiveness. All of us who have been wounded and that wound can never be healed completely through recompense. They can never say they're sorry enough It's a $3 billion wound. Jesus says to all of us, radical forgiveness. Our Lord comes today and proclaims that ridiculous gospel 70 times, 7 times.